Our first panel of the day, Risky Business, featuring James Callister, Bluma Vroner, and moderated by Jay Gormley.
So, hey everybody, welcome. My name is Jay Gormley. I am the Chief Investment Officer and COO Advisor for Zimmit Healthcare, and I am joined on the panel today by two of my friends and colleagues here, and I will let them introduce themselves, and we'll get into the topic of the panel in a second after they introduce themselves.
Sure, I'm James Callister. I'm the Chief Investment Officer at CareTrust REIT.
Hi, my name is Bluma Vroner. I'm lead one of the teams of healthcare lending at CIBC Bank USA. Hi to my colleagues that are out there.
And before we kind of get into the meat of the panel, which is risky business, and I do enjoy a good pun, so I'm very excited that that's the name of the panel. I was going to come out here in my jockey shorts, but I figured that would probably be a little over the top. But you can just keep that visual right there for the panel. You're welcome. It's a little gift from me to you. But I think just to talk for a second from background is that, so James, talk a little bit about CareTrust and what you look for in a tenant, and also sort of the overall size investment portfolio, just some general descriptions, if you don't mind.
CareTrust was formed about 9 years ago. It was spun off from the Ensign Group. The Ensign Group had both real estate and ops, so the real estate was spun out. And, we are a publicly traded REIT. We own primarily skilled nursing. I'd say about 80% of our portfolio is skilled nursing. We also own some assisted living and memory care. And, we really actively look for primarily skilled nursing facility deals, but we also do assisted and memory care and some behavioral. We really look for really properties that we feel like we have an operator or can develop an operator relationship for. We feel like each deal really is going to be dependent on how good the operator is. So we really try to pursue those opportunities where we feel like we have that operator who will fit. And so we spend a lot of time developing relationships with operators and focusing on finding where really no deal is too small for us. We'll do one-offs, we'll do portfolios. We really just want to find buildings that we feel like can generate a sustainable rent stream with the operators. We're primarily, most of our facilities are out west. I think our biggest states are California and Texas. But we actively look in every state. We're very focused on trying to kind of grow our presence and exposure in the Southeast and Mid-Atlantic, which isn't uncommon right now, and really looking to develop operator relationships that we feel like we can match with real estate opportunities that pop up.
Well, thank you. And Bluma, as a lender, what sort of portfolios are you looking at? What areas are you lending in? What's sort of your ideal deal size at this point?
So right now we have about over $4 billion into this market, and we define healthcare rather narrowly: skilled nursing, assisted living, memory care. We do have some behavioral and some ancillary businesses. We are lending on a nationwide basis. Our deal size can range from really a small line of credit to a $250 million deal that we will syndicate part of it. We look really carefully at the characters of our borrowers. And really, I think the character is probably one of the most important things that we look at, and how good they operate and what they care about. And you go into a facility and you want to see that they really care about the people that they're taking care of, and everything else usually comes from there. If you give good care, profits usually follow that. And so that's something that we're really focused on, and based on that, we'll do the deal.
And I think that's a fantastic kind of segue into the meat of this presentation. So how do you figure out if someone's good? We obviously, a lot of it is touch and feel. A lot of it is meeting people, personal relationships. This is a relationship-driven business. The skilled nursing facility space is a relatively small space. Even when you look at large REITs such as yourself, some of the primary operators, the multi-facility operators, opportunities like this to interact with operators, vendors. But when you start stepping away from the soft stuff and into the harder data-driven analysis, what kind of data points do you really look at when you're looking at an acquisition? What really drives your acquisition strategy from a data perspective?
I think it's a number of things. I think it's, primarily looking at the historical performance and seeing how the margins are, seeing if it's positive cash flowing or not, and really drilling down on, the cash flow. And, we view especially skilled nursing as really almost hyper-local, right? We just feel like you really have to understand the exact market where the buildings are. And we try to talk to as many local resources as we can about the area. And really, we work really closely with the operators, especially now, to jointly develop underwriting that we think can work for the building and works for the operator. And we really have to do that because some things are just really difficult to underwrite right now. I mean, labor, I'm not sure in some areas how you really get to the right labor run rate. And so we work really closely with the local operators to focus on, the data in that area, from, what the labor situation is, what hospitals are in the area, how many Medicare beneficiaries are there in the area, what census and occupancy is like at the competitors, and what's the managed Medicare situation, and just really looking at, are there revenue opportunities here, expense opportunities here, or both? And I think right now, of critical importance is just the Medicaid rate and what the state is or isn't doing. I feel like you hear a lot, right? And so you have to, sometimes it's difficult to separate the anecdotal, you hear constantly, well, rate bumps coming. And then separating that from, well, what's really the circumstances? Is it going to come soon? Is the state implementing it sooner or later? Is it a for sure thing? And that's a key, we think, data point for us, especially right now, coming off the ending of the 3-day waiver.
Well, I think that's a fantastic point. I think this idea that Medicaid rates used to be relatively universal in the way they were applied, right? There was two kinds. There were cost-based, and then there were price-based, and some had case mix, some didn't. But with the rise of some of the IGT programs that are out there, the rise of the UPL, the rise of how people are dealing with the FMAP, which is the federal matching percentage, as you guys know, the federal government kicks in a chunk of money for Medicaid during the pandemic that went up by a couple percentage points. Certain states have tried to figure out ways to maintain that extra federal dollars by doing, I think the best way is some exogenous Medicaid financing schemes. Well, maybe we shouldn't call them schemes, but schemes. And so, but how those are represented are so interesting. In some places they come as quarterly payments direct to the operator. In some places they're built into the rate. Sometimes they're called quality. Sometimes they're blatantly called UPL. You don't really know, and so that's hard. But Bluma, when we talked about this topic before, you had an interesting point about the demographics. Talk a little bit about what you look at in terms of employee availability going forward.
So I think one of the things that we look at is whether it's urban or rural, we want to know where you're going to be able to get employees from and where you're going to be able to get residents from. One of the things that we will also look at is what's happening in that county. Are they losing population? Are they gaining population? And we'll ask that question: where are you getting the employees from? How are they staying? How are you retaining employees? We ask a lot of those questions because in some of these cities or even smaller towns, they're losing a lot of population. And even if you buy a great facility, you may not have where to get employees from, or they have to travel really far to get there. And that can be an issue. And so we will dig down into that and ask those questions and see what the plan is.
I think that's an excellent point. I think one of the problems that we have as an industry is data integrity. So overall, data in the skilled nursing space, and well, maybe I'm wrong here. I've spent most of my career in the skilled nursing space, and I've always taken it as a fiat that our data is not great. Would you agree with that overall assessment that the publicly available data is flawed?
Yeah, it just seems to be conflicting. You just never know if it's accurate or not, we feel like. And so it is kind of a catch-22 because you want to know the numbers and get into them, but you have trouble trusting why numbers can be so different depending on the source that you use. I think, candidly, like eCap Intel has been huge for us to try to really feel like we can get the best sense of the numbers and putting them together and trusting a source. But it is, my background is a real estate attorney and finance attorney, and it's the one area of real estate where you really feel like, is this data right? Mm-hmm. Right? And it's hard to get the right data. So I think that's a very unique challenge to the industry.
I think another challenge is how old the data is.
Yeah.
So many times you're living in 2023 and the data that you're looking at is 2 years old. And things change, and things are changing so much, especially during COVID. And so how do you know that the data is accurate for today, or that what you're looking at is relevant? And that's where eCap Intel has been really helpful, and honestly, Jay has been really helpful. When we have questions, we can call him, and we ask a lot of questions, and we'll call Ari Stowis, and sometimes they'll refer us to Jay. But when we want to check out a certain market, what's going on there. So
full disclosure, both my mom and Ari's mom did send checks to Bloomer before the, but thank you for that. No, we appreciate it. And again, what we try to do with the product is try to give insight against the data. Because this idea that all this data is quote unquote publicly available, but it's not publicly accessible. It's really hard to get your teeth into the data. And there's a couple of things that have always stuck out to us, and I'd love your feedback on them, is the idea of the difference between occupancy and census, right? We throw around occupancy as a term all the time, like how occupied is a place. But really, occupancy is just a way to express census that you can compare between facilities. But it has no value in and of itself because the numerator and denominator can change arbitrarily. If beds are coming out of a state, the occupancy can look better as the census craters. So, when you're doing underwriting, when you're communicating with clients, how hard is it to get those concepts across? How hard is it to try to understand that, yeah, the occupancy is up in the county, but it's so hyper-local, how does the census really play in?
I feel like operators in the industry are getting better at understanding why census is more important, really, when we look at underwriting than occupancy. Because, a smaller facility that's 100% occupied, if they're having labor or other challenges, they still may not be cash flowing. And so you really have to look at the census and what the revenue is going to be versus the cost that they're facing. I feel like operators are getting better and more sophisticated at understanding that, and more, careful as they put together their underwriting, that they aren't making assumptions based on occupancy that really won't be able to prove themselves out going forward.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've started to notice that the fiat value of a bed, the taxi medallion value of a bed, has become less important than it used to be. 5-10 years ago when I was coming into the industry, it was gospel that you would never sell a bed. You would never close a bed. You'd never get rid of a bed. That's occupancy opportunity for you. Never get rid of it. Whereas now I feel that cash is king. The cash flow is what is driving these values. Would you agree with that assessment?
Absolutely. At 100%. And you have a number of states where, if you get the bed count down a little or up a little, you get a different rate. So you've got a lot of operators who are looking to sell off beds so they can qualify for the better rate. But I think they realize that bed means money and that they're going to try to, get as much revenue out of those buildings, as many bed rights as they can.
So I've seen a lot of interesting things over the years. So first of all, the mix that you have in your buildings is really important. As you said before, cash flow is king, in this industry. And sometimes reducing your beds so that you have more private or semi-private rooms is a really great way to increase your Medicare occupancy or your high-paying occupancy. And that turns out to be more worthwhile. We've also seen some really interesting stuff that people have done with big rooms, whether it's quads, or we had one facility that had an 8-bedded room, and they turned it into like an ICU. And they had somebody in that room all the time, 24/7. So if you had a resident, a family member that was sick, you knew that somebody was watching them at all times. And that was a great way, I thought, to be able to be creative in the way they were using their layout and the beds. And so I think, as we said, cash flow is king, and the number of beds doesn't really make the difference. And to me, to pay extra money or pay bed taxes or all that other stuff on beds that aren't being used, I don't understand it anymore.
Yeah, and I think that also goes into something that I've started to notice, is that when I first started doing financing work about 15 years ago, talking about cost per bed or price per bed, when you do an acquisition, that was the lingua franca. Like, everybody was talking about, this facility sold for $123,000 a bed, that was 3% off. We're doing all these analyses on that. I get the impression that because of the hyper-locality, because of what's going on with all these different markets, that people are really taking a step back from that. So do you all use price per bed or average price per bed in any part of your analyses as anything other than maybe a gut check?
I think we primarily just use it as a sanity check to see where we are. I think in the last few years, though, it has become a teeny bit more relied upon because you see so few deals that are actually cash flowing. And so you look at it and you think, well, how do I put a value on this when there's no cash flow or very little? So you do look at the per bed a little bit more to understand how's it how's this value comparative to what's been trading in the area recently? And you use that as a bit of a sanity check, but at the end of the day, well, we use that to make sure we aren't completely out of whack. For us, what becomes more important with these deals that aren't cash flowing or that are barely cash flowing is the data becomes more important than ever, because you're trying to put in realistic assumptions and you're trying to work with the operator to look at what levers can be pulled at the buildings to make them profitable, make them spin off cash flow, and where you think you can get that building, where is it going to be stable, and try to derive a value based on where you think it's going to stabilize out at. And you use the per bed to just make sure, the last thing I ever want to do, right, is break a record for a per bed deal just because, we can, or, whatever this or that. And so you do use it as a sanity check. And I've had deals very recently that come in that would break the bank or break the record for per bed. And so you look at it and the cash flow becomes, even more king than it already is, because if you're going to be paying this much, it's got to be very real cash flow. But relying on it just as a purchase, kind of a metric you rely on, I don't think we rely on it. We use it as a sanity check. We'd much rather look at things like rent per bed per month going forward and what that's going to look like, or what things have been trading, in that metric in the area, rather than price per bed.
I echo all of what James said. I don't really have much to add.
But, I think James made an interesting point, Bluma, that I'd love your take on is some of the old assumptions. So, right, the old assumption when underwriting a deal is that you come in and that the new operator said, well, clearly these people are idiots running this nursing home. And so therefore I am possessed with unique knowledge. The only person, I am the one who can come into Pig Knuckle, Arkansas, not to pick on Arkansas, but I can come into this and I can up the Medicare fee for service, and I can increase the occupancy, I can get rid of the agency tomorrow, I can cut my benefit costs by 20%. So obviously that's a tale, we're laughing about it because that's a tale that we all know hasn't proved itself out. And that tale was shaky pre-pandemic, and now post-pandemic, if it ever had, real validity, it has a lot less now. So what sorts are you looking at? What are you looking at when an operator comes to you for a turnaround? What sort of plan are you looking at that you're seeing as reasonable?
So we want to see in that area what they've done before. So we will literally put side by side, you know what I mean? Here's what they're projecting for nursing costs. Here's what they're paying currently for their nursing costs. Here's what they're projecting for food, for benefits. Literally everything on their income, on the income statement, we will check to see what they're paying for and understand how they're going to do it. And I will tell you the one thing that we are hesitant on even today, things that are contracted, whether that's supplies, your pharmacy, your food, those are relatively easy to buy in. Getting the nursing costs down, because really, even in the same city you could be in, it could just be a different area of the city, and it's just harder to get people to go there. So that one we will take a more measured approach on, but that's what we're looking for. We're looking to see what have they done.
And I think that's where the data becomes even more important, because when we're looking at an operator in a building that we might buy and lease to that operator, and they're giving us a pro forma of what they can do, I mean, the number one thing we want to look at is, what has this operator done at its other buildings, right? How does it operate those? How does it do with agency? It says it's going to eliminate it in 6 months. Has it done that before? Have they done that at other buildings before? And really trying to get as much data as we can to understand, is their pro forma realistic based on how they've done at other buildings that they have?
Yeah, and one of the kind of the hyper-local of the moment issues that I've been dealing with recently the past couple of months is the end of the waiver. And so people, usually underwrite to a T12 or a T6 or a T3. The waiver ended in May. And so exactly how many waiver days folks had, especially on a turnaround, and what that looks like, that seems to be, for me anyways, one of the hardest things to adjust for. And so we've been trying to pull waiver days from 22 and do some projections to figure out, and we're finding somewhere between 18 to 20% of the Medicare volume in 21 and 22 were driven by these waiver days. And that was a much higher number than I thought it was going to be perfectly honest. And so I think that is something we've tried to account for. But what other, the pandemic has been so uneven, and the pandemic has been so roller coastery, now that we're quote unquote normal, do you think there's any validity in a deal that goes back to 19 and says that we're going to achieve what happened in 2019? 2019 was our year. This facility, has been down, but we think 2019 is our benchmarking. Do you think that's a realistic goal for an underwriting?
In occupancy, maybe. On expenses, heck no. There's no way.
Mm-hmm.
And we haven't bought into that almost since the beginning.
Payer mix too, I'd assume?
Payer mix, again, so that will be a lot from the data that has. How many Medicare, admissions are there? Is there where to get them from? Can you receive them? We've asked a lot of questions. Now that the waiver has ended, how are you, or before the waiver ended, how are you preparing yourself for the end of the waiver? And, again, we've seen a lot of clients that sailed through it, were able to keep their numbers up, and we had a lot of clients that had a dip for 1 or 2 months till they got their act, so to speak, back together, and were able to bring that Medicare back up. But almost from the beginning, I said, people that are used to getting paid, certain more dollars an hour, you're not taking them back down. That's not going to happen. It wouldn't I wouldn't be able to do that. So I don't know how anybody else is going to do that. And so that we haven't bought into for a long time.
Yeah.
And I think, I often wonder when we get, deals that come in, what year it's going to be when we finally stop seeing 2019 as being the focus historicals that we should base our pricing off of. Because it's the first thing every time. This is what it did in 19, this is what it did in 19. And it's not 2019. I think the margins are different. Labor is dramatically different. And you're right, you're not going to go back. And so you really have to look at more and more, all the data you can get your hands on to see if this is a new normal, quote unquote, what's that new normal in this area, right, and what it's looking like.
I would tell you the margins have also changed. If we before thought that 15 to 20% was a relatively okay margin for skilled nursing, I think those margins have gone down. There are certain states where you can get that still, but on the whole, the margins have gone down. And so we have to see if it can underwrite to lower margins.
Yeah, I've also seen a lot of regional variation in those margins. States are, even though national occupancy is lower than it used to be, it's all over the map, and you're seeing a real dichotomy between the for-profit operators and the non-for-profit operators on an occupancy level, which we really hadn't seen before. And you've certainly seen margin differences, but and in some states that's a big deal, in other states it's not a big deal because the number of non-for-profit operators is at this point de minimis. That basically transitioned. However, what I find fascinating is the excuse me. What I find fascinating is the role in which these regional variations play into the underwriting. What is an acceptable margin in Texas is probably going to be different than an acceptable margin in New York, to pick on two states that are very, very different. But how do you adjust for that when you're doing national lending? Like, how do you take that to a credit committee and say, these are different margins than we can express, we have to identify? How do you explain those regional variations?
So once again, if you're underwriting to cash flow, whether the margin is 10%, 12%, or 17%.
It's cash flow.
It's cash flow.
Right.
And so we look at that margin just almost as a gut check.
Got it.
To see, is this somewhat reasonable?
Mm-hmm.
When we see really high margins, we'll start asking a lot of questions because you just worry that there's something not right with the numbers.
Right.
I don't know that our committees necessarily focus on the margin. They're really focusing on the cash flows.
And I think that's really, if you're going to take anything from this presentation, other than the fact that my mom bribed these two, is that I think it's important to think about this idea of the importance of cash and the importance of data inconsistency, right? Because one of the things that happens is that sometimes the data is so flawed, and so therefore you have a false sense when you're brought a deal by a broker, or you're taking it to a bank, or someone's bringing it to you for underwriting, that this is a normal thing. So getting that insight, but again, cash flow at the end of the day is the most important thing, and then developing pro formas that feed into that cash, then feed into the debt service seems to be really how the underwriter's done more than ever.
Absolutely.
Now, one of the things that I think that would be interesting to talk about is that obviously experience is key in a market, but often you have operators trying to come into new markets. So how do you weigh a lack of experience, and we know cash on hand versus cash on hand? If someone has a lot more cash, are you willing to waive some of those experience requirements? How does that play out? How do you mitigate a lack of experience in a market?
I want to know what due diligence they've done on the state.
Mm-hmm.
I want to hear from them how they're planning on going in, what do they know about the way the payments are done, what research have they done except for looking at numbers on a spreadsheet. Again, some of those contracts that they have on food, pharmacy, supplies, they can bring over from state to state. So that works. But I really, really want to know what they've done to look into that state and what due diligence they've done. And then we will go and do our own due diligence on that state and check it out.
I mean, I think you can tell pretty quickly, because if you know the operator, and if they're the kind of operator that is on top of developments, is nimble and changing as rates change or as whatever billing changes, or if you see them always being proactive and energetic and nimble and making changes and really getting into the gritty, they're likely going to do that in the new state as well. And they're going to make sure they do it. And so if it's an operator you really know and trust, then we kind of feel like they'll figure it out. They'll get it, and before they go in, they'll understand the rate, they'll understand the local conditions. So we really try to focus on, like Luma said, the character of the operator. And the last 3 years, 4 years, you can get I think we've been able to get a really good sense of operators who are on top of things and nimble and trying, and how came through the pandemic and all of its difficulties and the grind of it all. And if they're still there and still in the dirt of it, they're going to figure it out in the new state.
One of the things that we'll also look at is how often are they going to be there at the facility, especially when they're going into a new state. This is not a business that can be run from an office, a few states away. This is really a boots on the ground sort of business. You got to be there all the time to know what's happening in your buildings, to understand your employees, to get to know the residents. It's a people business all day long. It's an operating business.
Almost always, if we have a portfolio that fails, it's almost always a remote-based operator who's 5-6 states away.
Mm-hmm. And I think the other thing that I found is that it's hard to stay on top of 50 Medicaid systems. It's a really hard thing to do. So when you're looking at multiple states, what do you see as the role and the responsibility of your tenant or of your operator or of your borrowee? Is that the right word, borrowee? Margaret G. I always mess that up. Borrower, borrowee, or yeah, whatever. Borrower, sorry. Of the borrower. What is their role in educating you all about the Medicaid process in that state? How do you partner with them on the information flow?
To me, it doesn't matter if we educate them or they educate us. The key is we have to get on the same page, and we have to know that we have looked at it in depth and we understand it, and we understand what's going to do in the future. Sometimes they'll come with that knowledge. Sometimes we want the deal, and so we'll do what we can to educate them and hire consultants who can help them understand the rate in that state. And I think, again, whether it's a consultant or other tenants, like local resources are huge. I mean, I'll give you an example. I mean, Georgia's changing a bit of the way they calculate the Medicaid rate, and they send out these letters that show your shadow rate, what your rate will be when the new system goes into place. And we looked at that and we thought, wow, these rates are going down. That's not great. But then here, talking to a wonderful Georgia operator I know, says, well, this is why those shadow rate letters really aren't the truth, and kind of going through what the impact really will be, and just reaffirmed to me how important constant dialogue, constant understanding. Are we both landlord and tenant, or lender and borrower, educated and up to speed on what's happening with the rates? And oftentimes we'll look at how active is the operator in the local kind of regulatory environment. Do they go to the association meetings? Are they involved in them so that they have background and understanding of the rates?
So if I have to educate the borrower, it's probably not a good thing. So I look for our borrowers to be able to educate us and to be able to explain it to me almost like Medicaid for dummies in whatever state they're going to be in. And to really, I need to know that they have a good understanding of what they're going in, how the rate is comprised, and what they're going to do to be able to, so to speak, get the most out of it and make sure that they are structured appropriately. So that really is important to me. And so I need to know that they have done their research and have really looked into it and that they have planned accordingly.
Yeah, I mean, and I think the other thing we're starting to see is Medicare Advantage penetration, and the impact of Medicare Advantage. I work for Zimmet Healthcare, and we are very focused on Medicare as, it's really the bread and butter of what we do in addition to some of the data analysis and the underwriting support that we give. And we have really been focused on this idea that there is a debt out there that the Medicare Advantage companies are putting under the backs of the skilled nursing facilities. You can look, and we've got a debt clock on our website that talks about for each individual facility how much money this year has been lost from Medicare Advantage from Medicare fee-for-service to Medicare Advantage. So when you're doing underwriting, when I used to look at underwriting, I looked at the managed care rates, but it was sort of like, interesting, and as long as they were about in line with what had been the year before, great, that's fine, let's focus on Medicaid, let's focus on Medicare. How's that changing for you? I know for me it's changing, but how's it changing for you when you look at a pro forma in terms of that Medicare Advantage piece? How do you talk to borrowers about increasing those rates or maintaining the rates that exist?
I mean, you just have to get into it. I mean, it's here to stay. It's an issue. You got to work with the operators to make sure they understand it and have been successful with it, or have the relationships that are going to help the facility or facilities continue to perform, even if there's some variation in it. So really, I think that now it's more and more becoming a critical part of the underwriting, understanding what the current situation is and how good this operator is at understanding and working within the framework of Medicare Advantage in the locality where they are.
So I would tell you, we'll ask the questions, what negotiations have you already started with with different Medicare Advantage companies that are in your area? We just had a meeting the other day with one of our clients who said they had a nice concentration, and they told one of them, Advantage, we're not accepting any more of your patients. And they're like, well, you have to. And like, no, we don't.
Right.
And until we renegotiate this contract, we're not going to lose money on each of these residents. And so knowing and really understanding the costs that takes to take care of these residents and making sure that they're having those conversations is really important.
Yeah, I think one of the problems of Medicare Advantage is that even with all the public available and public accessible data that we have, Medicare Advantage rates tend to be pretty opaque. There's not a great transparency there for what operators are getting, and there's not a great transparency of really even contract to contract what a level one really means. And as the rest of the industry moves away from rehab-driven reimbursement, the Medicare Advantage plans are there. They're still having these contracts that are driven by your rehab minutes. And so I think that one of the data deserts that we have to navigate ourselves with is that piece. And I don't have an excellent answer for it yet, but I think that one of the things that we're going to work on, and I know that others need to work on, is trying to pressure at least the federal government to change some of the data collection that they do. During the pandemic, the feds made everybody give their occupancy every week, right, to the CDC. That has been so powerful, and we're so excited that that's going away. Now with the PPJ data, you get flawed, but at least real-time staffing data that we can look at. Now the staffing mandates beyond the purview of this panel. Obviously, we all have strong opinions on it, but the idea that that data exists, and it isn't just the day the surveyor showed up, but that you can actually see what people are incurring, that's good. So trying to pick up this other piece of data, I think, is going to be really key for the industry.
I do too, and being familiar with the contracts and the terms of them, right? I mean, there's been a few times in diligence you find that reimbursement is conditioned on the facility having a certain star rating. Mm-hmm. And if it doesn't have it, you sit there and say, well, is this going to be an issue? You're a 1-star, and this managed care contract requires a 3-star, and how are you going to work around that? How are you going to get a new deal? Or how are you going to get comfortable they're going to keep reimbursing while you try to get it to a 3-star or whatever it might be?
And what is the role of clinical quality and clinical quality data in your underwriting? Either of you.
So more than this actual star rating of the facility, we'll look at that quality measure rating. And that to us is, because that's something that's really in control of the facility on a day-to-day basis. It takes a long time for the actual star ratings to move, but those quality measures are really important to us. And so if we're seeing low quality measures, we're probably turning down the deal.
Mm-hmm. And I think too, we feel like for us, it's really important that, while it may not be exactly numbers, that we tour every building we're going to buy, everyone we're looking at, and we look at the regulatory history and everything else. And, Care Trust is unique, I think, a little bit amongst the REITs because a significant number of our 16 employees are former nursing home administrators. So they get in there and they try to get a sense of how the care is, of the staffing, how happy the residents are or are not, and trying to get a real good view of how that operator handles care by walking their buildings and talking to their residents.
And as there's been more of a focus on quality and focus on staffing ratios, you're also starting to see some state-specific restrictions on profit taking. In New York, they call it the 70-40 rule. California had a proposal on something around that. Connecticut's got some proposals out there that even get so far as to specify a certain number of RN hours, within a period of care. How are you addressing those when you're looking at a deal in the underwriting?
Hoping and praying they don't happen, I guess. But
staying away from New York, with the 10-foot cattle prod?
Yeah, that's right. Look, we try to be as aware of it as we can. California has some things percolating that we feel like are worrisome. Mm-hmm. They've got the bill proposed for the 85% direct spending requirement. They have a new bill proposed by next year requiring the minimum wage for healthcare workers to go from $21 to $25. These really worrisome, RN required minimum hours, why LPNs don't seem to be having that same. So it's like you got to have all these RNs, it's going to be a lot of money, and how are the operator going to deal with it? We try to keep as close an eye on it as we can, and really try to get involved in a way that our hope and prayers can become or translate into the things, not going through, or at least having a funding component with them.
And we've asked our clients, tell us how you're going to do this and how it's going to work, and show us how this is going to affect your costs and what the plan is. And I can tell you in New York, we've had some operators that have actually shown us exactly how they're going to realign or recategorize certain of their expenses to make sure that they're fitting with the rules.
And look, we got to look at the data on the entire, in our minds, we got to look at the data now on all the portfolios that we have to see if some of these things happen, what's the impact, right? What's the impact on coverage? What's the impact on the stability of the operator? And looking at what are these buildings running now in terms of staffing, and is this going to be a real problem when, some of these things may go through, and making sure we understand, and talk to our operators about what are we going to do to, get things at a place where this can have as small as impact as we can have it.
And I think it's, again, this idea that the rules of the game are changing, and some of the data that these old rules have been based on, are changing. This idea that on staffing alone, right, the PBJ data is fundamentally different than the data we get from the cost reports. We look at the cost report data, which shows you how much staffing actually was paid for, and we find it to be consistently higher than what's reported to PBJ. Now, why is that? I can't tell you. My strong suspicion is that people mess up their PBJ submissions because it's hard to do, and agencies are awful at it. And even when you put it out for a third party, it's a highly technical, highly hard report to file. I'm not sure that's true, but that's what I believe. But when you get away from that, these rules of the game, they keep changing. So I think it's what is the role of the lender, the PropCo owner, the REIT, in working with their operators to be active within the states? Do you see yourselves as empowering your tenants, empowering your borrowers? Do you get in that with them, or do you stay kind of Switzerland on some of these issues? Do you guys advocate for policy changes?
I think you both have to. You got to advocate for the operators, right? You've got to advocate for them getting involved, helping them get involved ourselves, mm-hmm. and trying to impact the regulatory and reimbursement environment and try and do things that are going to protect the operators. So I don't think, when we have a portfolio that's 80%, 85% SNF, I just feel like it'd be pretty reckless for us to say, good luck, operators, call us when it's over. So we got to get in there, yeah. And we got to know what worries them the most and what we can do, to help. So
we ask our operators what they are doing. I cannot be honestly say that we've as a bank, have been very involved.
And you're a bank.
Right. I did ask JJ to give us some wordings of emails that he would want us to send so that we could help in that way, you know. But other than that, we just have constant communication with our clients, and we talk to them all the time about what's happening in their states.
And so before I sort of get to the end of the panel and I have follow-up questions, any questions from the audience? Any questions anybody would like to ask our panelists before we wrap up? Okay. Well, so I guess the last thing I would ask is if you wanted to give a take-home message, right? If there's one thing about the role of data in your underwriting that you'd want folks on the panel here to take away, what would you want to tell them? What would you want to take away from this panel if it was like a big take-home point? Mine would be that data inconsistency can be mitigated through grit and work. You know, this idea that if things look odd, there's a reason behind them. And so find the reason. And if you can find the reason and tell the story, you can get accurate data that maybe is not as precise as you'd like it to be, but at least it gets you where you need to go. You know, I always find that when someone from outside the skilled nursing facility say, you do something really silly here, it's not because we just like to be silly. There's a reason behind it. You know, and so that would be my take-home point that I wanted to take out, is that the comparative data, while flawed, is really important, but data without context, data without explanation, data without a story behind it is worse than useless, because it can lead you down a path that really leads to either underestimating your risk exposure or being overconfident in, you know, the ability of either your ability to meet debt service or the people borrowing from you to achieve those coverage ratios or whatever you need them to achieve.
You know, I think it would be to do all you can to find the data and use the data. And by find it, I mean finding resources that you can trust, that are comprehensive, utilizing landlord and lender relationships to ask what data they might have that may be helpful or useful to you, and finding what data is out there, you know, an important point in your enterprises. And trying to find ways, because I think there really is great data out there that's compiled and put together that can show really interesting things and to help you understand where you can be more competitive or what, you know, things might be out there. I get surprised sometimes, you know, how little operators, I think that, you know, we're the big bad REITs, I guess, and they feel like, well, I don't want to ask them for input. But we've got a lot of data just from the portfolio, right?
Right.
And we're dying to share it because we want the operators to be successful. So use the resources that could be out there.
I would tell us help you. So instead of just sending us a spreadsheet with numbers, take that extra time to really put the explanation behind those numbers, to give us that explanation of why you think you're going to be able to hit these numbers and what's behind, whether it's the expenses or the revenues. And when you send us afterwards quarterly numbers and they're off, like, instead of waiting for us to call you and ask you what happened, like, it just helps us so much more when you're proactive and sending it to us and saying, here's what happened this quarter. Yeah. Here's what happened. Here's what we're doing. Here's how we think next quarter's going to look.
Yeah, we once had an operator send me a business plan that literally had 2 bullet points that said, reduce agency and increase revenue. And I thought, well, that's fantastic. What other business plan do we need? But it's, like Bluma said, it's understand, okay, here's where we're struggling. Here's what we think we need to do. And here's how we're going to do it and why we think the data supports that we're going to be able to pull it off.
Well, that's perfect. Well, listen, I want to thank my panel so much. Thanks so for being with me. I thank you all for coming, and I really appreciate it. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.